Myostatin is the biggest killer of your gains. Myostatin is a protein that's made in your skeletal muscle, and it's basically like a brake that slows down muscle growth. It tells your muscle fibers to slow down protein synthesis, and it reduces the generation of new muscle fibers. Its job is basically to keep muscle size within a certain range, to stop your muscles from getting too big. If you have muscles that are too big, you can start to have metabolic problems, joint stress, like heart problems, sleep apnea, and so on, like you see in some bodybuilders who are taking steroids. And muscle is a metabolically pretty costly tissue, so the body doesn't really want to hold on to it if it doesn't have to. And the importance of myostatin is made very clear when you take it away. So there are some animals that have a mutation that knocks out the myostatin gene or makes it non-functional, and these animals have abnormally big muscles. Like the Belgian blue cattle is one example where they have a non-functional myostatin, and that gives them about 20% more muscle mass than normal cattle. And then you can see similar results in genetically modified lab mice where they just become like freakishly jacked. And there have even been extremely rare cases of humans with mutations in like the myostatin gene or the receptor for myostatin, which make them more muscular or stronger than normal. So that all sounds pretty good, right? Maybe you're wondering if you can downregulate this myostatin somehow to unlock more muscle growth potential. And the answer is yes, you can. And if you wait until later in this video, I will tell you how to do that. First, let's quickly go over how myostatin works, how it limits muscle growth. I try and keep this as simple as possible. First, the myostatin binds to activin receptor type 2B and some other related receptors on muscle fibers. The binding of myostatin to these receptors activates SMAD2 and 3, which pair together with SMAD4, and then this complex moves to the nucleus and suppresses myogenic factors like MyoD, MyF5, and myogenic. And these myogenic factors are transcription factors which control gene expression, so they turn genes on or off. Specifically, the genes that turn muscle stem cells, which are also known as satellite cells, into muscle fibers. And you can see this process at the bottom of this picture. Myostatin binds, this signaling cascade happens, and it downregulates the proliferation or the multiplication of satellite cells, and it also reduces the differentiation of satellite cells into muscle cells. The signaling cascade also suppresses AKT, which releases FOXO, and that increases the transcription of atrogenes. Atrogenes are involved in atrophy. You can hear the similarity in those words. Atrogenes are upregulated in catabolic states, so they help to break down or atrophy muscle protein. So far, we have got myostatin causing less proliferation of satellite cells, fewer satellite cells turning into full muscle fibers, and increased muscle breakdown. So this is a catabolic environment. Myostatin also antagonizes anabolic pathways, so it suppresses AKT and mTOR. And if you watched my mTOR video, you know that mTOR upregulates protein synthesis. It's very anabolic. Myostatin also competes for SMAD4, which I mentioned earlier. So the anabolic BMP, or bone morphogenic protein, together with SMAD1, 5, and 8, also need SMAD4. So if you've got lots of myostatin, that means that SMAD4 makes a complex with SMAD2 and 3 instead of SMAD1, 5, and 8. So instead of BMP driving hypertrophy, you have SMAD2 and 3 binding to SMAD4 instead and suppressing hypertrophy. So in summary, we've got less proliferation, less differentiation, more muscle breakdown, and blocking of anabolic signaling pathways. So really not good at all for building muscle. So what actually happens if you downregulate myostatin? Well, you're going to have increased proliferation and differentiation of satellite cells into myotubes, which then form muscle fibers. The atrogenes that break down muscle are downregulated, so you have less muscle breakdown. Also, myostatin is no longer competing as much for SMAD4, so the anabolic BMP SMAD158 pathway can do its thing with SMAD4 and drive hypertrophy. So overall, it's a much more anabolic environment, and the result is that you're seeing muscle cells growing larger, which is hypertrophy, through things like mTOR, and this is the main effect in adult humans. And if you suppress myostatin during development, you get a greater number of muscle fibers, which is known as hyperplasia, at least in animal models. And all of that adds up to bigger muscles. You do also see a shift from slow twitch muscle fibers to big, fast twitch type 2 muscle fibers. And these type 2 fibers, they are stronger in absolute terms because they're just bigger. They have a bigger cross-sectional area, which means they can produce more force. But in this myostatin downregulation scenario, they're not as strong as you might expect for that size, right? The force per cross-sectional area is actually reduced. So strength per unit of muscle is worse when you have like genetically or chemically downregulated myostatin. Also, since these fibers are shifting to type 2, which are glycolytic, they are much less metabolically efficient. They have fewer mitochondria, and these muscles will run out of gas very quickly. So the ideal situation, in my opinion, would be naturally downregulated myostatin, a reasonable amount, like not a super physiological amount, in the context of good mitochondrial function, so there's plenty of energy available, strong, well-conditioned tendons and extracellular matrix, because these tissues adapt more slowly than muscles, and that is why you see guys on steroids getting injured a lot, because their muscles have grown too fast. They're too strong for what their body can actually handle. Their tendons and connective tissue just can't keep up, so they break. And generally, you want to be just in good health and have good recovery, because all of this extra anabolism needs to be supported. So you don't want it to be held back by like poor sleep, inflammation, micronutrient deficiencies, and things like that. Just one last thing before we get into the practical tips for how to lower myostatin. There are two endogenous factors that modulate myostatin. Those are follistatin, which neutralizes myostatin, preventing it from activating the activin receptor, and follistatin increases with exercise, especially resistance exercise. A higher follistatin to myostatin ratio generally correlates with more hypertrophy. So you want more follistatin and less myostatin. And the other one is decorin, which is a proteoglycan that is embedded in the muscle extracellular matrix, and it binds to myostatin locally, kind of acting like a sponge in the extracellular matrix that traps myostatin before it can reach the activin receptor or get out into circulation. And again, resistance exercise increases decorin expression. So those two, follistatin and decorin, will be underlying the mechanisms of some of these practical methods that I'm going to share with you now. So let's talk about how to lower myostatin so that we can grow more muscle. I'm going to split this into a rough hierarchy of evidence, like the things that we are most sure work to lower myostatin, with like lots of evidence to support them, and going down the stuff that might work but it's more speculative or more indirect. So it's not a perfect order, but generally highest priority first. Tier 1, like the non-negotiables, is resistance training. There is strong evidence in humans, in animals, in cell models, that regular resistance training in the long term lowers circulating myostatin and increases follistatin, especially when you're using heavy loads and decently high volume, like 60 to 80% 1 rep max or more on big compound lifts for multiple sets. So in terms of your programming to minimize myostatin, something like training each muscle 2 to 4 times per week, using heavy compounds, multiple sets, going close to failure, and potentially including some higher density training, so like shorter rests or rest pause or cluster sets. Those could be good to include sometimes. All of that is pretty standard advice for hypertrophy training, minus the density stuff. If you do too much high volume, high frequency, high intensity cardio, that can blunt the hypertrophy signaling, and in animal models, excessive cardio will reduce muscle size even if myostatin is low. But if your cardio is pretty moderate and it's timed intelligently, then that will support your metabolic health, mitochondria and stuff, which can indirectly improve the anabolic environment. Just don't overdo the cardio training. Like training for a marathon or an Ironman, they're great goals, but they're not going to be ideal if you're trying to lower myostatin and build muscle. Second tier is metabolic health and nutrition. So get your body fat down to a healthy range, like below 20%, down to like 15 or so is good. Being very fat and having insulin resistance are both associated with higher myostatin, which is going to suppress muscle growth. Fat loss in older adults leads to a reduction in myostatin. So if you're seriously overweight, your number one priority really should be losing fat, getting on a moderate cut with sufficient protein. This is going to improve basically every biomarker in your body. Then you can worry about the little optimizations. Protein intake and leucine are very important. The standard recommendation for protein, 0.8 to 1 gram per pound of body weight, or like 1.6 to 2.2 grams per kilogram of body weight. This is more than enough for building muscle. Some people will even say you can get away with less. As I said in my mTOR video, leucine is very important for muscle growth. So let me describe a study to you to demonstrate. If you have a limb that's immobilized, so you can't move it, myostatin will increase and the muscle will atrophy and shrink. If you take leucine, this blunts the myostatin spike and it preserves anabolic signaling, so the muscle doesn't shrink as much. And that's what this mouse study showed. So you should have 3 or 4 protein feedings each day, each of them with over 2.5 grams grams of leucine, ideally, from things like dairy, eggs, meat, fish, or whey protein. This is good for keeping mTOR elevated and keeping myostatin suppressed. Tier 3 is some supplements that could help. Creatine is the main one. Resistance training together with creatine leads to a bigger reduction in myostatin than resistance training plus placebo, and better muscle and strength gains, of course. Creatine is very well established for that. 3 to 5 grams of creatine every day, taken any time of day, it doesn't really matter. This is the best supplement to take for muscle and sport performance. If you only take one sport supplement, make it creatine. Another good supplement is HMB, or beta hydroxymethylbutyrate. This is a metabolite of leucine, that amino acid I mentioned earlier. HMB is very useful to reduce protein breakdown in catabolic states, like in a big caloric deficit or untrained elderly people or being bedbound, right? One guy in my comments told me that he took it for fasted training to get lean, and it worked really well to preserve his muscle and get him shredded. There's a study where myostatin was used on myotubes, which made them shrink, of course. That's not surprising. But when the scientists applied HMB with myostatin, the myotubes did not atrophy. So HMB was so powerful that it basically blocked the atrophy signals from myostatin, and the myotubes stayed at their normal size instead of shrinking. So most people should be taking creatine, and if you're in a catabolic state, like doing an aggressive cut, or you're older, or you're injured or something, and you're trying to preserve muscle mass, HMB might be worth looking into. 3 grams per day of that, split into 3 1-gram doses. Don't take it all at once. Now, tier 4 is targeted nutraceuticals. Epicatechin is the first one. This is a flavanol that you find in cacao or dark chocolate, and it increases the follistatin to myostatin ratio even in humans. But then you do also have larger randomized controlled trials in trained adults, which show no difference compared to placebo. So for most guys, especially if you're trained, this probably won't be making a big difference. The next one is one that I hadn't really heard of before, which is fortitropin. This is fertilized egg yolk extract. There's a study in humans where a leg was immobilized for 2 weeks. In the placebo condition, myostatin spiked and the muscle shrank, which is what we can expect. With fortitropin, myostatin did not spike, so it decreased the myostatin signaling, but the muscle still shrank the same amount. So fortitropin does seem to lower myostatin, but that alone isn't enough to prevent muscle loss. So again, this might be useful, but it's probably not going to be a game changer. Omega-3s, there is very limited data to suggest that it affects myostatin, but omega-3s do create a more anti-catabolic state, and it might upregulate some of the pathways that myostatin would normally suppress. Vitamin D could potentially help to lower myostatin, especially when it's combined with exercise, and it is negatively correlated with myostatin. So if you have more vitamin D in your blood, you're going to have lower myostatin. For healthy people, you just want to make sure that you're not deficient in vitamin D, which is actually pretty common, especially if you have dark skin and you're living in more northern latitudes. You are always going to struggle with vitamin D deficiency. So for vitamin D, get midday sunlight in the summer months without burning, of course. Eat fatty fish and consider supplementing, although supplementation is no replacement for sunlight. It's not the same. Another one is quercetin. This can inhibit myostatin signaling and promote myotube differentiation in cell studies, but there's nothing in humans yet, so fairly weak evidence. You can supplement quercetin directly, or you can get it from things like capers, red onions, and shallots. Tier 5 is recovery, stress, and hormones. Maybe this tier should be higher, just for general health, like you should get all of these things on point, but anyway, it's a bit more indirect. Chronic stress and high cortisol increase myostatin expression, and they impair muscle protein synthesis. So you don't want to be chronically stressed. Keep your stress under control. I have a video on lowering cortisol, which you'll find very useful. Sleep deprivation can lower testosterone and IGF-1, although not every study actually shows that, but regardless, you should be getting good sleep for many other reasons. The point is that poor sleep increases catabolic signaling, potentially including myostatin. Things like alcohol abuse and smoking are linked to higher myostatin and muscle wasting. And lastly, testosterone itself lowers myostatin in the muscle. So when guys take testosterone, their muscle myostatin expression is suppressed. I have lots of videos about testosterone and a full testosterone optimization guide linked in the description if you want to optimize your testosterone to lower myostatin, build more muscle, and get all the other benefits of high testosterone. So make sure that you're sleeping well, managing psychological stress with like breath work and mindfulness and stress management techniques. Don't overtrain, that's very stressful on your body. Avoid heavy drinking and smoking, and increase your testosterone. Tier 6 is pharmaceuticals and gene therapy. These are unnatural ways to modulate myostatin, like drugs, SARMs, and gene therapies, but I'm never going to promote using these kind of things on my channel because they're dangerous and I'm interested in natural optimization. So to summarize the practical tips, train hard with heavy resistance training, like 3 or 4 times a week, focusing on progressive overload, good technique, high intensity, and optionally using higher density methods like rest pause or cluster sets. Pretty standard hypertrophy training advice. Stay metabolically healthy, so keep your body fat in a range where insulin sensitivity is good for you. So for the vast majority of men, they're going to fit in that like 10 to 20% body fat range. Somewhere in there is going to be ideal for most people. If you are very fat, over like 25% or something, cut your body fat down while eating plenty of protein, and during that cutting period, obviously do your resistance training and some cardio. Get your protein intake on point, 1.6 to 2.2 grams per kilogram per day, or 0.8 to 1 gram per pound. Split into like 3 or 4 feedings of 25 to 40 grams of high quality protein. Each of those feedings ideally having 2.5 grams of leucine. Take creatine every day. That's the most important supplement. 3 to 5 grams a day. You don't have to cycle creatine. You can just take it every day pretty much forever unless you really react to it poorly. And then you can consider some targeted like extra supplements and things only once you've got the first 4 really locked into place. So like omega-3s, vitamin D, especially if you're deficient, HMB if you're in a catabolic state like you're cutting or you're an older adult or you're pretty inactive, epicatechin and fortitropin if you want to try them out, but keep your expectations reasonable. They're not going to be magical. And lastly, protect your recovery and your connective tissue. So sleep well, avoid chronic stress and lots of like alcohol and toxin intake, and include some conditioning and movement variety so that your connective tissue gets some kind of variation in the stimulus. That's basically it. If you do all of these things, you're going to lower myostatin and shift your body towards a more anabolic state. Hopefully you're already doing all of these things just naturally, but there are always a few little tweaks you can make to further optimize. Thank you for watching. Let me know if you have heard of any other ways to lower myostatin in the comments, and I'll see you next time.